Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is a J-Man time, and today I have a video on one of the most forgotten Italian tanks of the Second World War, the Italian Fiat 3000 Model A and B, also known as the Fiat 3000 L21 and L30 series of light tanks. The Fiat 3000 was an Italian copy or upgrade of the French Renault FT-17. At the end of World War I, Italy ordered some FT-17s from France during the final year and a half of that conflict between 1917 and 1918. These small numbers of Renault FT-17s plus two Fiat 2000 heavy tanks were the only Italian tanks of the First World War. The Fiat 2000 tank never actually saw frontline use, and later on, between 1919 and 1920, the Fiat company began reverse engineering the French Renault FT-17 into what is now known as the Fiat 3000. The Fiat 3000 had a main armament of two 6.5mm SIA Model 1918 light machine guns. These were light machine guns that were developed at the end of World War I as a replacement for the Fiat Revilli M1914 machine gun. Later on, these were upgraded to two Fiat Model 1929 machine guns. The armor thickness of this vehicle was 6 to 16 millimeters, and the vehicle had a speed of 21 kilometers per hour or 13 miles per hour and had a crew of 2. Later on, in 1930, there was a second version of the Fiat 3000 known as the Model B. The Model B was armed with one 37mm Vickers-Turney Mod 37-40 tank gun. This was a high-velocity anti-tank gun that had a semi-automatic ejection system, so it was rapid fire. The armor penetration of this 37mm gun was 22 to 47 millimeters at ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 yards. So it was a pretty powerful gun. Also, the 37mm Vickers-Turney gun would also become the standard armament of the Fiat M1139, which was the tank that replaced the Fiat 3000 on the battlefields later on in World War II. To an extent, that is. The speed of this vehicle was 21 kilometers per hour or 13 miles per hour, and the vehicle had a crew of 2 also. Only 152 Fiat 3000A and Fiat 3000B tanks were produced between 1921 and 1931. 100 Mod 21s or L21s, these were the Fiat 3000s armed with machine guns, 2 machine guns, and 52 of the Mod 30 tanks armed with the 37mm high-velocity gun. These tanks were used as the standard light tanks of the Italian army, along with the 2 prototype heavy tanks, the Fiat 2000, and they were the only tanks of the Italian army, along with a small number of Renault FT-17s purchased at the end of World War I. These tanks formed the backbone of the Italian armored divisions all the way up until the introduction of the L333 series of tankets later on in the early to mid-1930s. Now, the Fiat 3000 saw extensive use with various other countries outside of Italy. Ethiopia was one of the first client states who ordered the Fiat 3000 in 1928 and 1929. At least 5 or 6 Fiat 3000s were sold to Ethiopia, and they were later used against the Italians during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War between 1935 and 1936. Albania also purchased at least 6 Fiat 3000 tanks in the late 1920s also. Hungary also purchased the Fiat 3000 tank. At least 5 of these were sent to Hungary in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and they were actually used during the Slovak-Hungarian War of March 1939. This was a rare border skirmish and Hungarian invasion of Slovakia, or the Slovak state, following Germany's annexation of the Czech regions of Czechoslovakia. Both China and Japan also purchased a few Fiat 3000 tanks in the interwar years, and these were later used during the Second Sino-Japanese War between China and Japan, and these tanks were used between 1937 and at least 1941 before being replaced by more modern tanks. And the last countries to use the Fiat 3000 were Latvia and Denmark, who had purchased these tanks in the late 1920s and early 1930s also, although Denmark would only have the tanks in service for 4 years before they too were replaced with armored cars. Latvia would continue to use their tanks all the way up until 1940, when Latvia itself was later annexed by the Soviet Union and the tanks were taken over by the Soviet Red Army. What happened to these tanks after 1940 is unknown, but they were probably destroyed in combat with the Germans, as later on, Germany would invade the Soviet Union in 1941, and this included Soviet-controlled Latvia. During that time period, the Germans would destroy or capture many ex-Latvian vehicles serving in the Soviet army. The Italians would first use the Fiat 3000 tank in Libya during the pacification of Libya between 1922 and 1933. There was a conflict in Libya known as the Second Italian Sinuses War, and this was a war between the Italian colonial forces and the Sinuses tribal forces or tribal militias led by Omar Mukhtar. This lasted until 1933, and several Fiat 3000s were also used in that conflict along with one Fiat 2000 heavy tank. Later on, these tanks were supposed to be decommissioned in favor of the Fiat M1139 series of medium tanks and the L333 series of tankets. But later on, in 1939, when World War II began, these tanks were reactivated, and Italy still had about 27 of these tanks still operational at the start of World War II. Their first operations were against Albania during the Italian invasion of Albania, and later on against Greece in 1940 during the Greco-Italian War. Some of these tanks also served in North Africa during the fighting in Libya, and also during the fighting in Italian East Africa and places like Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somaliland. The Fiat 3000 continued serving all the way up until 1943. In 1943, the Italians still had about 20 to 30 of these tanks stationed in mainland Italy during the Allied invasion of Sicily and later Greater Italy as a whole in 1943. The last known action of these tanks were during the Battle of Gila, which was an amphibious battle involving the American and Italian forces. A handful of these tanks were used against American troops and tanks trying to land on the island of Gila. It is assumed that some of these tanks might have been in use by the Italian Social Republic. In 1943, Mussolini later took over northern Italy and turned it into a German puppet state known as the Italian Social Republic. Mussolini later created his own Italian army, known as the RSI. The RSI was known for using a ton of Italian tanks, including outdated tanks and armored cars. So the Fiat 3000 could have served in the army of the Italian Social Republic alongside more modern Italian and German tanks during the continued fighting that lasted from late 1943 until the end of the war in 1945. The Fiat 3000 is considered the most powerful variant or offshoot of the French Renault FT17, as the Fiat 3000 is literally just a copy of the FT17 made in Italy with a more advanced and more powerful gun, the 37mm Vickers Tourney gun. One of the most surprising things about the Fiat 3000 tank was that it actually outlived many of its replacement tanks, including the Fiat M1139. The Fiat M1139 medium tank was supposed to replace the Fiat 3000, but by 1942, almost all of the M1139s had either been destroyed or captured during the fighting in North Africa. In fact, during the final battles of North Africa in 1943, the Italians still had a handful of Fiat 3000 tanks still in use. So the Fiat 3000 actually outlived or out-survived the Fiat M1139 that was designed to replace it. It also outlived many of the armored car units or armored car variants that were also built during the fighting in North Africa. So despite being the oldest tank in use by the Italian army in World War II, it actually outlived many of the newer tank models and even some of the newer armored car variants, making the Fiat 3000 one of the, luckiest tanks of World War II, or one of the most lucky, outdated armored fighting vehicles of the Second World War, with the only other vehicle having this much luck being the Italian Lancia Z1 armored cars, which were also of World War I vintage and post-World War I vintage. So what do you all think of the Fiat 3000 Model A and B, or the L21-L30 series of light tanks? These tanks here were the most powerful variant of the Renault FT17. These tanks here has some of the, greatest survivability of any Italian tank of the Second World War, with the exception of some of the later medium and heavy tanks used by the Italians. So what do you think of these tanks? Please tell me in the comments section below, and until next time, this was a J-Man Time, signing off.